In March 2026, Pixar released a film about a teenage girl who can turn into a frog. The title is Hoppers. The trailer was unmemorable. The marketing was minimal. Industry analysts predicted a soft opening, somewhere in the $30 to $40 million range domestic. By Sunday night of release weekend, Hoppers had pulled $46 million domestic and $42 million international. $88 million worldwide for an original animated film, with no franchise attached, no celebrity casting, and no licensed soundtrack. The Rotten Tomatoes score landed at 94%. The CinemaScore came back as an A, and inside Pixar that weekend marked the end of what has been called internally and publicly the Pixar Curse. To understand what Hoppers actually means, the curse needs context. Between 2017 and 2025, Pixar released 11 films. Of those 11, only 3 made back their production budgets at the box office. 2 were direct sequels, 1 was a Toy Story spin-off, the other 8, every original Pixar concept released in that window, lost money in theaters. Onward, Soul, Luca, Turning Red, Lightyear, Elemental, Inside Out 2's marketing pull, all of them either opened soft, failed to leg out, or were quietly redirected to streaming. Pixar, the studio that defined modern animated cinema, had become a streaming feeder for Disney+. The reasons for the curse were structural. Disney's pandemic-era decision to send Pixar's films straight to Disney+ broke the theatrical habit. Audiences learned that if they waited a few weeks, they would get the new Pixar movie at home for free. Once that habit set in, getting families back into theaters for an animated film became almost impossible. Pixar's brand value collapsed in the same window. By the start of 2026, internal Disney memos described Pixar as having a, quote, perception problem, end quote, and discussions had begun about whether to merge the studio fully into Walt Disney Animation Studios. Hoppers was not supposed to be the savior. The film was greenlit during the Bob Chapek era, before the strategy reset. The story, about a girl named Mabel who discovers she can transform into a tree frog and uses that ability to communicate with her dying grandmother, had been in development for over 4 years. The director, a first-time Pixar feature lead named Daniel Chong, had been quietly making short films for a decade. The budget was $95 million, mid-tier for Pixar. There was no licensed song, there was no celebrity voice. The marquee was carried by Mabel's voice actress, a 13-year-old newcomer named Ileana Berkowitz, who had only one prior role. What Hoppers did differently was return to fundamentals. The film is short, 88 minutes. The animation style is bold, with stylized water and clay-like character textures that the Pixar pipeline has not produced since the early 2000s. The score, written by Michael Dana, who scored Life of Pi, leans entirely on woodwinds and small string ensembles. There are no big production numbers, there is no superhero structure, there's just a girl, a frog, and a grandmother. The film commits every single minute to being smaller than it needed to be, and the audience felt it. The reviews described the film as a return. Variety called it, quote, top drawer Pixar, a reminder that when this studio is firing on all cylinders, it will take you places you've never imagined, end quote. The New York Times said Hoppers reminded them what Pixar used to be. Letterboxd ratings, which usually skew harsh against animation, hit 4.3 out of 5 within a week. The film is currently the highest rated theatrical Pixar release since Inside Out in 2015. The audience reaction was even more striking. Kids under 12 gave it 90% positive on PostTrack, a tracking metric that measures word of mouth. 61% of kids said they wanted to see it again immediately. The CinemaScore A is rare for any animated film, and almost unheard of for a Pixar release without an established franchise. Adults reported crying in theaters. Theater operators across America reported their first sold-out weekend matinees for an animated film since 2019. The second weekend confirmed what the first only suggested. Hoppers held to $30 million domestic, that is a hold of negative 35%, which is unheard of for an animated original. Pixar's last comparable second weekend hold was Inside Out 11 years ago. Within 10 days, the film had crossed $110 million domestic. By the end of week 3, global gross had crossed $240 million. What this means for Pixar internally is enormous. Pixar's last decade had been built on the assumption that originals do not work theatrically anymore. Hoppers refutes that assumption in a single weekend. The greenlight pipeline at Pixar, which had been heavily skewed towards sequels and known IP since 2024, is now reportedly being rebalanced. 3 previously shelved original projects, all from the post-Toy Story 4 era, have been quietly fast-tracked back into production. The internal mood, according to multiple animation industry trade reports, has shifted from defeated to vindicated. For Disney's larger animation strategy, Hoppers also creates pressure. Walt Disney Animation Studios has spent the last 2 years trying to position itself as the more commercial sibling to Pixar's art house leanings. Wish, the most recent Disney animation original, was a financial disaster in 2023. Encanto's success in 2021 has been treated inside Disney as an outlier. Hoppers' success forces Disney Animation to reconsider its own pipeline, because the lesson Pixar just delivered is that originals can work, you just have to make a film that is actually worth seeing. The longer-term implication for the studio is also worth noting. Toy Story 5 is scheduled for summer 2026. Until Hoppers, that film was widely treated as the only Pixar release that could move the needle this year. Now Toy Story 5 is the second most anticipated Pixar release of the year, and the financial expectation has shifted. The studio no longer needs Toy Story 5 to save the brand. Hoppers already did. There's also a quieter cultural beat worth pointing out. Hoppers is the first animated film in over a decade that has produced original meme content rather than catchphrase merch. The grandmother's catchline, said softly in the third act, is now repeated across TikTok by adults talking about their own grandparents. The film has been credited, in early reporting, with sparking a measurable uptick in calls to elder care hotlines and in young people reaching out to grandparents during the post-release weeks. Pixar has not had that kind of cultural footprint since Up in 2009. For audiences, Hoppers is the answer to a long-running question: whether the studio that made the Toy Story trilogy, Up, Wall-E, and Inside Out still had it. The answer, after a decade of disappointing box office and streaming-bound originals, is that Pixar still has it. The studio remembered in a single film how to tell a small story with weight, how to trust an audience to come for craft instead of marketing, and how to make a film that earns its tears. The Pixar curse is over, Hoppers ended it, and the next decade of Pixar is going to look, finally, like the studio fans signed up for in the first place.